Hello and welcome everyone to our second screencast lecture on the lymphatic system. You know, the last time whenever we left off, we were talking about the major lymphatic vessels, both the right lymphatic duct and the thoracic duct, and the drainage system to those vessels which help return lymph to the blood. Today, I'd like to start out by talking a little bit about another lymphatic vessel. These lymphatic vessels are referred to as lacteals. Lacteals are lymph vessels that are actually located in the villi of the small intestine, these little finger-like projections in the small intestine that you'll learn about whenever we get into the digestive system. The job of lacteals is to drain digestive fats that enter the villi and then eventually return those digestive fats to the blood. Eventually, lacteals will unite to form lymphatics that will enter into the thoracic duct. So all lymphatics that carry lymph from lacteals that lymph will be returned to the blood via the thoracic duct. The lymph, by the way, in the lacteals has a kind of a milky white appearance, and that's because of the high concentration of fat that it is composed of. And as a result, we have a special name for this high concentration fat lymph. We refer to it as chyle. And don't be confused. We don't want you to confuse that whenever we get into the digestive system with something called chyme. Chyle is a type of lymph that has a very high concentration of fat in it and therefore has that kind of milky white coloration to it. Lymph is normally clear, as we talked about earlier, but with this high concentration of fat, we refer to it then as chyle. So here's a diagram of what we're talking about. And this would be a diagram, artist's conception of the small intestine here. And you can see that the small intestine, the inner lining of the small intestine is thrown into these finger-like extensions. And each of these finger-like extensions are called villi. The purpose of these villi is to increase the absorptive surface area of the inside of the small intestine. And here's one of these villi blown up very, very large. So we have digested foods are going to enter the villi from the lumen here of the small intestine and be absorbed across these columnar epithelial cells into this space in the internal villus. And inside the villus in this space is occupied by, we can see a capillary bed here, and then also we see this yellow extension that runs through the length of the villus. This is a lymphatic lacteal. Now the idea here is that whenever foods are digested, let's say carbohydrates are broken down into glucose molecules, the glucose molecules are transmitted across the cells and enter the lumen. And then the glucose molecules can easily enter into the blood capillary system. Glucose, amino acids from the breakdown of proteins can do the same. And those molecules are relatively small compared to the breakdown products of fat. Fatty acids can be fairly large, and because they're so much larger than glucose, amino acids, and other nutrients, it's very hard for them to enter the blood circulatory system directly through the capillaries. So we have these lacteals, which are larger and much more permeable, and therefore can handle the transfer of fat. So the fat enters the lacteals, then enters the lymphatics as a part of the lymph we now call chyme, and now gets returned to the blood via the thoracic duct. So that's the importance and significance of lacteals. Okay, now let's turn our attention to some other lymphatic organs that we can take a look at here. And whenever we take a look at lymphatic organs, we're going to define or divide, the lymphatic organs into what we call primary and secondary lymphatic organs. So when we take a look at it, primary lymphatic organs are going to be the organs where the one of two things happens. Either the lymphocytes are differentiated, or we could say born there, they develop there. This is where the lymphocytes develop, or where those lymphocytes become immunocompetent. In other words, they differentiate to take on their specific activities that they're responsible for with regard to the immune system. So primary, they're born or become what we would call immunocompetent. Secondary lymphatic organs, on the other hand, are where the lymphatic organs, or excuse me, the lymphocytes go, and they contain the lymphocytes that are actively doing their job, doing the job they were designed to do. So let's take a look at some primary and secondary lymphatic organs. The first one we take a look at is the red bone marrow. Now, we've talked about red bone marrow before, or at least you've talked about it in an A&P1 class. We know that red bone marrow carries out hemo or hematopoiesis, the formation of the red blood cells. And the red bone marrow is located, as mentioned before, in most of the bones of children. And in adults, the red bone marrow, much of the red bone marrow converts to yellow bone marrow. But in adults, still, we have red bone marrow located in the sternum, the ribs, basically the flat bones of the body, the vertebrae, part of the pelvic girdle, and the ends of the humerus and femur. These are all places where we can find amounts of spongy bone tissue, and in the pores of that spongy bone tissue is where we find red bone marrow. But red bone marrow has another function other than just hemopoiesis or the manufacture of red blood cells. Red bone marrow also contains, as we saw in the hierarchy whenever we were studying blood, stem cells that can lead to the formation of lymphocytes. So red bone marrow is also where the two major types of lymphocytes are born, so to say, where they're developed. These two types of lymphocytes are, first of all, B lymphocytes, which we've talked about before, or we could just refer to them as B cells. The B lymphocytes not only are born in the red bone marrow, but they also mature there, and they take on, so they become immunocompetent. They take on what their role will be in fighting against pathogens in the immune system. Once they mature, these B cells will then migrate to the secondary lymphatic organs where they will do their job for the immune system. So they'll migrate to places like the lymph nodes, the spleen, the tonsils, where they'll do their job. And what is their job? Well, we'll see in the immune system, their job is to produce antibodies. The other type of lymphocytes are called T lymphocytes or T cells. Now, these T lymphocytes are, again, going to be born in the bone marrow, but once they are born, they will be transferred from the bone marrow to the thymus gland. And in the thymus gland is where they will differentiate or become immunocompetent and develop the ability to do their job for the immune system. So they're going to mature in a different place. They're going to mature in the thymus. So once these cells mature in the thymus, they will migrate through the circulation, and look at where they end up. They end up in the lymph nodes, the same place the B cells do, the spleen, the same place the B cells do, and the tonsils, same place the B cells do. We can find B cells and T cells in all three of these places. But what's the difference here? B cells, while they're born in the bone marrow, also remain in the bone marrow and mature or become immunocompetent. That's the B designation. On the other hand, T cells or T lymphocytes, once they're born, they'll leave the bone marrow and travel to the thymus, where hormones called thymosins in the thymus will act upon these cells to differentiate them, and they will become immunocompetent and take on their role, but they'll learn their role in the thymus, so they're called T cells. The T is a designation for where they became immunocompetent at. So I hope that makes sense to all of you. Okay, a second primary lymphatic organ is the thymus gland then. Remember, the primary lymphatic organs are where the T cell, or excuse me, the lymphocytes are either born or mature. Okay, so our second primary lymphatic organ is the thymus gland. This is located in the upper thorax, in the mediastinum, between the lungs and dorsal to the sternum. So it's going to be right here, just behind the sternum. The sternum's been removed in this diagram to show the presence of the thymus gland. Structurally, the thymus gland is very similar to the structure of lymph nodes. Now, I know at this point you don't know what the structure of a lymph node is, but very shortly we'll be discussing that structure, so we'll look for that. The thymus gland is very large during fetal development. So while the child is developing inside the mother's womb during the fetal stage, the thymus gland is very large. That's because it's very active at that point in time, and T cells are maturing during fetal development. But after birth, the thymus gland tends to begin to atrophy or become smaller, shrink back in size. And by the time we hit our teen years, it tends to be very small. And as you get to, let's say, for example, my age, um, well into adult maturity, there can only be very minor remnants of it, and it's mostly been converted to fat. The reason for that is because the thymus gland's job is to train lymphocytes to become immunocompetent as T cells. Once that training is over, the thymus gland has done its job, and now it begins to atrophy or shrink back. The function of the thymus gland, this is where the T cells, as we mentioned, mature. The thymus gland does secrete hormones that I mentioned, collectively known as thymosins. These thymosins promote the differentiation or the maturation, growth, and activity of the T cells. So it's under the influence of these thymosins that the T cells become immunocompetent. All right, that takes us now to our secondary lymphatic organs. And the first of the secondary lymphatic organs we're going to take a look at are the lymph nodes. Remember, these are the sites where the B and the T cells actually become active and do their job, play out their roles in terms of the immune system and defense against pathogens. So with regard to lymph nodes, the location of lymph nodes, as we've seen in the previous diagram, is all along the larger lymph vessels. They look like little beads or P-shaped organs that are located all along those lymphatic vessels. However, they are most prevalent in the neck, in the groin, the cubital fossa. What's the cubital fossa? You may recall the cubital fossa is this indentation at the front of the elbow. The popliteal fossa, which is located at the back of the knee, the axillary region, so in the armpit, and the mediastinum, which is located in the thoracic cavity, in the center of the thoracic cavity. The function of lymph nodes is to filter lymph before it re-enters the blood. So as the lymph now is collected from the lymphatic capillaries and transferred to the lymph vessels, then in the larger lymph vessels, as the lymph passes through, it's going to pass through these lymph nodes, and it's going to be cleaned, filtered. So structurally, whenever we take a look at the lymph nodes have basically three main regions, like many organs in our body do. The outermost region is the capsule, which is actually the outer covering that separates each lymph node from its surrounding environment. And beneath the capsule, there is an outer region referred to as the cortex. Now, the cortex itself is divided into several compartments. These compartments are referred to as lobules. And within the lobules, we're going to find masses of the lymphocytes, the B and the T cells. These masses of lymphocytes are called follicles. Follicles are also known as nodules. So it all depends on who you're talking to or who you're listening to when they speak, whether they refer to as follicles or nodules. You should know that they're referring to the same thing. But again, these are masses of lymphocytes, the B cells, and the T cells. The B cells themselves are lymphocytes that, when they become immunocompetent, learn how to produce antibodies as a part of the immune system. The T cells, on the other hand, will learn to destroy macrophages, large white blood cells, cancer cells, and foreign tissue. The third region of the lymph node then is the medulla. That's the central region of the lymph node. So here's how it plays out. Here's a diagram that helps you understand what we just talked about there. So if we look at this artist's conception of a lymph node, we can see this gray outer region of the lymph node right here, the covering, and this is referred to as the capsule. Now, just beneath the capsule, there is this outer region here of the lymph node, and this outer region of the lymph node just below the capsule is referred to as the cortex. Now we note that the capsule has extensions, these kind of needle-like extensions that subdivide the cortex then into compartments. And these compartments are known as lobules. So we can see, we can count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 different compartments that we can see here, separated from one another by the trabeculae, and these compartments are called lobules. Okay. Now, within the lobules, we have masses of T cells and B cells. These are referred to as follicles, but here in this diagram, this is why I mentioned this, the follicle is actually referred to as a nodule. So the nodule is the same thing. Okay, so we have nodule here. All right, so within the nodule, then we have masses of T cells and B cells. We take a look at it. We look at the lymphatic nodule here in a kind of a blow-up view or an enlarged view. We can see that B cells are located here in what is called the germinal center of the lymphatic nodule. Whenever you see the term germinal, it usually means actively dividing cells. So we're going to see actively dividing B cells here. And then coming and going in the lymph node and being transferred between the lymph, the blood, and the other lymphatic organs, we're going to see these T cells. So the T cells are out here around the periphery of the nodule, while the B cells are located in the germinal center. Now, another structural thing you'll notice about the lymph node here is that these vessels that are attached to the lymph node. So there are vessels that actually carry the lymph into the node. This lymph that's being carried into the node is being carried in to be filtered. And so there are vessels that carry the lymph in, as represented by the green arrows, and then there are vessels that carry the lymph out. And we can see these green arrows showing the lymph exiting. But one of the things we notice is that there are several of these lymphatic vessels that carry the lymph in. And by the way, the vessels that carry the lymph in are referred to as afferent lymphatic vessels, while there's only a single vessel that carries the lymph out. And this is referred to as the efferent lymphatic vessel. Now, what's the reason for that? Well, if we have several vessels carrying lymph in, we have a higher volume of lymph trying to come into the node than a single vessel can carry out. So even though this vessel is a little enlarged here, it can't carry out as much lymph as comes in. So what happens is the lymph comes in, it slows down, it begins to circulate, and that gives time for the lymph to be filtered and cleaned inside the lymph node. Okay. All right, our next secondary lymphatic organ then we take a look at is the spleen. The spleen is located at LUQ. You may recall that means the left upper quadrant, right? So we can divide the abdomen along the medial line, and then right across the top of the hips here, we can divide into quadrants. And this is the left side of the patient's body. So we can see this is the left upper quadrant. Here's the diaphragm, and the spleen is located just below the diaphragm. Structurally, when you take a look at the spleen, it is very similar to the lymph nodes. However, the spleen is the largest lymphatic organ, and it has two major tissue types associated with it. These two major tissue types are the red pulp and the white pulp. So the function, the red pulp is where the blood is filtered and any microorganisms are removed. The white pulp contains lymphocytes, and these lymphocytes make antibodies. So what happens is, as blood enters the spleen, it passes first into the white pulp. Any microorganisms that are in the white pulp, B lymphocytes, can make antibodies that can bind up and neutralize those pathogens that may enter and get into the blood. And then in the red pulp, the pathogens are filtered out and removed. By the way, whenever we take a look at this over here, be careful what we mean by white pulp and red pulp. You can see the red pulp is kind of reddish, pinkish red in coloration. But the white pulp, these kind of white dots here are just reflections of the light as we take a look at a cross section of the spleen. But the white pulp is this kind of very lighter, almost kind of yellowish, kind of pigmented areas that we see in the spleen. So that's the actual white pulp, while the red pulp is kind of pinkish red in coloration. Okay, our next secondary lymphatic organ would be the tonsils. These are small masses of lymph tissue that surround the pharynx. Their job is to trap and remove bacteria and other pathogens that enter through the throat. Whenever we take a look at tonsils, we actually have three types of tonsils that we look at. The first type of tonsil is called the palatine tonsil. Palatine tonsils are actually what we commonly refer to as the tonsils. They're located at the back of the throat, and they're these typical kind of like little golf ball structures that we see. Here we can see the uvula, the gumdrop sticking down, and on either side of the throat, we can see the palatine tonsils here. In addition to the palatine tonsils, we also have the pharyngeal tonsils. The pharyngeal tonsils, by the way, are also known as the adenoids. So if you've had a tonsillectomy, you may have had an adenoidectomy as well, where the adenoid tissue has been removed. But in this individual, this individual's had a tonsillectomy, and the palatine tonsils have been removed to make it easier for us to see this kind of spongy tissue at the back of the throat, at the roof of the pharynx, top of the pharynx. And these are the pharyngeal tonsils, or the adenoids. And then finally, we have the lingual tonsils. The lingual tonsils are located at the back of the tongue. Here in the artist's conception, we can see the lingual tonsils back here. But don't go to a mirror and try to stick out your tongue and see your lingual tonsils. They're back there almost where the tongue is attached. The root of the tongue is attached to the hyoid bone. So in most cases, you can't stick your tongue out far enough to be able to see the lingual tonsils. Okay, so that completes our discussion of the lymphatic system. And remember, the lymphatic system is a system that houses the immune system. The immune system is our only system that is not an organ-based system. It is entirely housed within other systems of the body, and mainly the lymphatic system. So we'll stop there now with our discussion of the lymphatic system. And in our next lecture, we'll begin to take a look at the immune system.